Okay, it's your week 5 lecture. There was quite a bit of material to cover in week 5, so I want to try to touch on the key components of both the impending crisis and soul by soul. It's a great opportunity this week to connect the two, which hopefully you'll do in the discussion that we have due. But I want to quickly go over some of the key points here. Number one, we left off with the Compromise of 1850. That's kind of where we were last discussing in class. So the Compromise is meant to kind of be the final say on the issue of slavery in the territories. We have California in, we have the idea of popular sovereignty. So hopefully, at least according to most Americans, the problem is resolved, and many politicians too. Is it? Do you think it's resolved? We have the benefit of hindsight, right? We know that the problem probably is not solved. Not everybody was happy with it. The North obviously is not happy with the fugitive slave law and what that requires of Northerners or people that live in non-slave states. And the South is maybe not quite happy with the admittance of California to the Union as a free state, because we know that it shakes up the balance of power between free and slave states in Congress. So there are some rumblings, of discontent, even as the Compromise is meant to solve the problems. And one of those rumblings is, yes, the S word, right? Secession. There is a movement in some southern states after the Compromise of 1850 to secede. So 1861, we know when secession actually happens, people have been talking about it for a long time, and even considered passing state laws or declaring secession in some states after the Compromise of 1850. And what's important is that didn't happen, right? That tells us that most of the nation didn't want to break the Union apart, North or South. That's the key, right? Both sections were willing to overlook the failings or the perceived failings of the Compromise of 1850 to keep the Union together. And the secession movement of the 1850s falls apart, or the early 1850s, it falls apart. But that kind of has an effect that's unnoticed and unexpected, because it looks like the people that cry out for secession are a radical minority, right? So people start to, or fail to, I should say, take the idea of secession seriously. And we're only a decade away from when it actually happens. You and I know that. Of course, they did not know that in 1850. But nonetheless, that attitude kind of makes its way throughout the nation, particularly throughout the North, that, hey, there are a few people in the South that are going to cry about secession. It's never going to happen. They would be foolish. The South would never take the risk of leaving the Union. So that's kind of an unintended effect of the failure of the secession movement in the 1850s. Now, what's the biggest problem, do you think, with the Compromise of 1850? I think that we've talked about it a little bit in the past. Some of the reading certainly is pushing in this direction, but it's that fugitive slave law, right? Where people now are bound, and the federal government is responsible for making sure that slave owner property is returned. And it's so, the law is so biased toward slavery that this outrages a lot of people. Now, as I say, a lot of people, remember, many Northerners, they're not that concerned about slavery, right? Certainly the Fugitive Slave Act upsets probably more people than normal, but really it's the abolitionists that are furious. It's the abolitionists that are more likely to resist the law actively. Many people might resist it passively, but it's a minority. Just like in the South, it's a minority of people that are crying for secession. In the North, it's a minority of abolitionists that are actively engaged in fighting or refusing the Fugitive Slave Act. All right. But with that said, let me back up just a minute. Why is that? Why are people willing to overlook the fugitive slave law? Well, it's just like in the South, and the idea, why doesn't the South just secede if they're not happy? Well, they want the nation as a whole wants to move on past the Compromise of 1850, past the issue of slavery in the territories. So we're willing in the South to overlook the admittance of California, for example, and in the North, most people are willing to overlook the fugitive slave law and move the nation forward. Okay? That all changes with Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you have some supplemental material in the module to take a look at that. I hope that everybody in the class has read Uncle Tom's Cabin. I know many of you may not have, and that's okay, but it's an important piece of literature, less so for its quality as a piece of writing than for what it does as a piece of propaganda. The website that I've linked in the module, you can actually look at the entire book and a lot of analysis. So maybe go skim through some of the key parts if you haven't read it, or if it's been a while and you want to refresh your memory. But here's what it boils down to, right? Harriet Beecher Stowe puts a touch of humanity on slavery. She makes slaves human beings, and that is critical in the 1850s as people are attempting to go back to business as usual, maintain the status quo, ignore the fact that slavery exists. In the North, it doesn't we don't see it in the North, so if we don't see something, it's much easier to overlook it, isn't it? Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin changes that. There's an impact, a human impact, as she talks about Eliza, for example, fleeing from the South, crossing the icy Ohio River with her children in tow. So it's a dramatic piece of literature, and there's a Southern response to it as well, right? How does Stowe portray Southern culture? How does she portray Southerners in general as people? How does she portray Northerners and people that are opposed to slavery? And of course, this causes a Southern backlash to Stowe's characterization of the South and the slave system. We won't really get a lot into that. If you're interested, there's a lot of literature on that. One that comes to mind is The Planter's Northern Bride, which is a novel that was written, I believe, by Caroline Hintz, and it is a direct response to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Stowe. So if you get a chance in your leisure time, I know what you love to do in your leisure time is read more, right? Take a look at that. But anyway, let's move on. The presidential election of 1852 is kind of the next threshold that we want to come over, right? Franklin Pierce, the Democrat, he wins without a doubt, or with no problem. He's almost a landslide victory, some might say. And this seems to close the issue, right? It's 1852. A Democrat's been elected. Franklin Pierce supports the Compromise of 1850 and says, hey, as a nation, it's time for us to move on. But it's not that simple. Underneath, there are problems beneath the surface. The Whig Party, for example, is starting to its foundations are starting to shake a little bit. Even though the South did not secede, the idea of secession exists, right? As an acceptable form of resistance should there be any further attempt to deal with the slavery issue, right? The South, in a way, collectively says, look, if the Compromise of 1850 is it, if popular sovereignty is going to be the way in the territories, we don't really have to worry about it. But if there's any attempt to deal with the slavery issue in the future, secession is an option. All right, that's a kind of a new attitude. And also in the North now, even though 1852 the election seems to put a cap on it, thanks to many historians would argue, and I would tend to agree with, that Uncle Tom's Cabin has changed the language and the conversation about slavery in the North. It's no longer maybe just an economic institution. It's no longer a necessity. It's no longer the lesser of two evils, whatever. The North, after the insane success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the North now says, hey, wait a minute, maybe slavery's immoral. Maybe this is not a question about the economics, an economic system or a labor system. Maybe this is a question of morality. So 1852 looks like things are going to go okay, but probably not. And we know that we know what happens here, right? And the next, stage that this is going to play itself out on is the railroad, or the attempt to build a transcontinental railroad, right? We know that war is coming. We know that within 9 years after Franklin Pierce is elected, the nation is going to be in civil war. But in the 1850s, people didn't know that. We need to remember that they're not, as we are, figuring out what leads up to the war. They don't know it's coming, so they're going about business as usual. Let's build the nation. People are trying to make a living. People are trying to move up in society. They're trying to succeed. And one of the ways that's going to happen for some is to get this railroad built across the nation, or to the Pacific Ocean, I should say. And the guy that is going to kind of lead the charge here is Stephen Douglas, and we've heard his name, and we've talked a little bit about Stephen Douglas, but here he is, right? This is going to be really what brings him front and center. He is one of the first politicians to take up the idea loudly of a transcontinental railroad. He's got some personal reasons for that. He has some investments, land investments that will pay off if he gets a railroad, a transcontinental railroad built. And the only way to do it is to organize the land that exists in the Louisiana Purchase. If you're not familiar, take a look at a map. But the Louisiana Purchase land is unorganized. The government, the United States government, can't really manage a railroad, sell the land, move people into the territories until a government is established, a territorial government. And the question is, how are we going to do that? It's kind of been untouched thanks to the Missouri Compromise. It's not been organized just yet. And the question is, how will we organize it? If Douglas attempts to organize these territories, will they be slave or free? And we know that thanks to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that land north of the southern border of Missouri is to be free. And the South is a little bit hesitant to accept this. So Douglas has to find a solution, and his solution comes in the Compromise of 1850 and popular sovereignty. He says the Compromise of 1850 has now replaced the Compromise of 1820, and these new territories should be organized based on the idea of popular sovereignty. And if that's allowed to happen, Douglas believes, well, the southern faction that fears more free states will be willing to accept popular sovereignty. And the flip side of that is the northern states will also be willing to accept it, right? Because it's the idea that the people get to choose. There's, as you can imagine, quite a fight over this. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 does ultimately become law. And the discussion over this is new. It's changed a little bit, just like Stowe changed the language about slavery. This does it as well, and it's no longer a discussion of the law. It's no longer a discussion of the Constitution. It's a discussion of somebody like Stephen Douglas being an evil perpetuator of slavery, and he must be stopped. That's at least what the Northerners are saying, right? So you can kind of hear in the language of the argument over the Kansas-Nebraska Act that it's becoming more of a moral issue than it is a legal issue. Of course, like I said, the Kansas-Nebraska Act does pass. It becomes law, and it makes popular sovereignty the law of the land. Basically, the territory of the Louisiana Purchase will be organized and into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and slavery will be allowed there based on popular sovereignty. And this does a lot of damage, of course, that we don't see, or they don't see just yet, but it makes popular sovereignty a tool for slavery. Now, rather than voting to prevent slavery in territories, the South sees this as their chance to spread and enhance slavery. And that's what Douglas makes it look like, that because he throws that bone to the South, right? He says, hey, look, if you want slavery in these territories, just come and vote for it. So he has turned popular sovereignty into a tool for slavery. If we think back about the Democratic Party, remember, it is a party of union. It's a national party, North and South. We have the Democratic Party really holding the nation together. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act breaks that, because it breaks apart the Democratic Party. And the Democrats in the North lose most of their power in the government. And the Democrats in the South, that's all that's left in the South, holding on to power there. And they become a stronghold of Southern political power. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act sends the nation down a different road. Obviously, not predicted. They didn't know this was going to happen, but it did. And it's important, as we know, going forward here in the next few years, what's going to come of this now. So with that, make sure that you are clear on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what it says and what it does. And let me jump over to Johnson here real quick. This chapter that you read about in Soul by Soul this week, it kind of goes hand in hand with what we're talking about in the impending crisis. Johnson is talking about Southern culture and the foundation of Southern culture. What is it? The foundation of Southern culture is slavery. The slave culture that the South is, it perpetuates slavery because you succeed in Southern culture through slavery. This is why Southerners are so hard pressed to let go of the opportunity that slavery might expand. If we keep slavery enclosed in the states where it exists in 1850, what will ultimately happen? Will it die off? Can it go on? Can people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, how will they ever move up if slavery is forced to die off? So, as Johnson says, Southern homes, Southern plantations, Southern cotton fields are shaped completely by slavery. That's how people create their identity, isn't it? Based on their participation in the slave culture, where they fall in the slave culture. Those places or those homes, those people that exist in the South without slaves, what are they? Where are they on the pecking order? Think about that, and you'll understand why it's so important as those Western territories open up. It's so important for Southerners to feel like they're not cornered, to feel like their system, their culture, their economy, their society can grow and endure. All right, have a great week. Let me know if you have questions about any of the material. I'm more than happy to discuss it further. Take care.